Welcome to the Stephen Mansfield audio podcast.
So our vice president went to China this past week, Vice President Biden, and while he was there, he made some comments that have caused huge furor here in the States because he was talking about the Chinese one-child policy. And what he said in China got people so stirred up that when he came back to the States, he sort of backtracked a little bit. But it raised the whole issue of this one-child policy, and I thought I would talk about that today and give a little bit of the background and explain why it's such a huge, huge issue. And then maybe we can learn a few things about population and abortion and things like that. In 1978, the Chinese realized that they had a population explosion going. And in a controlled state, in a state that is fairly tyrannical, a large population can be a problem because it's hard to manage everybody. Now, in a free market, even the scriptures say that a large population is to be preferred by a prince. And many countries evidence the fact that when they have a large population in a free society where there's education and social uplift, the force of that larger population actually means good things for the country. So China thought differently, of course. It's the 1970s. They're at the height of their Marxist, or the implications of their Marxist revolution. And so in 1978, they decide to mandate a one-child policy for every family. Well, I mean, it sounds, I guess, okay at one level, in one sense. You know, you got a big population, you can't manage everybody. You have a big, massive country. I think there are 1.3 billion people. So let's limit the population. Well, here's the problem with that kind of social engineering. In the last years, from let's say 1979, the year this actually went into motion, it was decided in 78, to 2011, this year, 400 million children who might have been born have not lived. It meant the removal of 400 million people from the Chinese society. Now, just for perspective, of course, that's many millions more than are in the United States. We have a country of about 330 million. And so the Chinese have removed from their society in the last 40 years or so, last 30 years, as many people, or actually more, than live in the United States. Now, that all is, I think we pretty much all know that and understand how that works. The problem comes in with how this has happened. And this is what Mr. Biden, I think, put his foot in. You know, I have to tell you, just as a little aside, that when I hear people say things like this, when I listen to people with whom I even disagree politically, I don't assume that they're stupid, and I don't assume that they're evil. You know, whatever Mr. Biden is, and God knows I disagree with him politically, he's not stupid, and he's not evil, and he's a man who's attempting to do good as he defines good in the world. So I'm not assuming that he just went to China, you know, to celebrate the deaths of hundreds of millions of people. But I do think that he did not understand what was happening in China, and part of the reason perhaps it doesn't land on him as it does on me and perhaps others is that he's pro-abortion, so he's not going to see abortion in the same light. But in order for China to accomplish this removal of 400 million lives from its society, first of all, it had to have forced abortions. Now, true, many abortions, I'm sure maybe the majority of them, were voluntary. Most people will comply with the state. You told them you have a one-child policy, they have one child, and then they abort every child after that, or, you know, if birth control does not take care of the situation. So let's assume that 55% of all abortions in China, you know, are voluntary. That's fine. That's not my fight. The issue, though, is that there are a huge number, we're talking about millions and millions and millions of women who are required to have forced abortions. Now, I want you to think about that. That means that probably while a state official, maybe an armed state official, stands by, you are forced as a woman to have your child removed from your body and killed. You know, if we assume that after conception, that there's some form of life in the woman's body, and that is my assumption. I believe it's the best of it's best science and the best religion, so to speak, in that perspective. Then that's what's taking place. You're removing a human being from another human being's body, and you're doing it by force. So not only do you have forced abortions, and I just want you to think about what that means and the horror it might mean for a mother and for a family, but then in addition to that, and this is where I think that many people in America need to be more understanding of what's happening. I don't mean understanding in a compassionate sense, but they need to be a bit more enraged. That obviously, in a society where you require one child, you're going to prefer males. Now, that's not a bigoted statement on my part. It's just a reality that if you are a farmer and you can only have one child, what do you want? You want a strong, muscular son who can, take care of things. If you're a city dweller and you know that you're going to get older and you're going to need to be taken care of by the next generation, you want a son who can make money rather than perhaps put yourself in the hands of a son-in-law you don't even know yet. I mean, whether you agree with that thinking or whether it makes you mad, that simply is the way it works. These are not my opinions. And so in China, what's happened is that not only is the gender of the fetus determined in advance and girls aborted in huge numbers, but then when girls are actually born to families as their first child, two things happen. In some cases, they're left to die. There's a huge amount of female infanticide, huge amount of it. Exposures, midwives and doctors encouraged to let the birth go badly. This is documented. This is well known. In fact, the Chinese don't even deny it. This is an above the board fact. And then the orphanages over there are filled with girls, because again, at a practical subsistence, largely rural, almost peasant level, which is a lot of China. Males are to be preferred if you're only going to have one child. So the anti-female side of this is huge. And I consider myself pretty much Christian feminist, and so this disturbs me deeply. I'm obviously pro-life, and I know many of you who listen to this are. Some of you aren't. Fine, we welcome you. But for those of us who consider abortion to be the taking of a human life in an illegitimate way, obviously the China one child policy is a huge issue. Because it means that hundreds of millions of human beings are killed by abortion. Then you have the forced abortions. Then you have infanticide of females, which is a huge issue. And then you have what you might call the abandoning of females. And I don't want to equate putting females into orphanages to be the same thing as abandonment, but the way it sometimes takes place in China, it is abandonment. So the Chinese one-child policy is one of the most abhorrent and anti-woman policies on the planet. And I think that Joseph Biden, who I think is a good man and he means to do well and he's not evil. We have to stop talking about people we disagree with as though they're the Antichrist. I think he's a pro-abortion Roman Catholic. He's a pro-abortion Democrat, and I think he doesn't think about abortion as being a great evil. So, but even if he removes the abortion side of this China one-child policy, there's still the forced abortion issue, there's still the infanticide issue, and there's still the abandonment issue. So he didn't fully understand what he was saying, and what happened was he got over there, he made a speech, he definitely, if the language is being reported correctly in any of the press, he endorsed the policy. And then then I think somebody probably got to him on Air Force Two coming home. By the time he landed, he had a press conference and met with some press and made a speech in which he had softened and in fact actually reversed his position. Well, again, we just don't seem to understand, I think as Americans, what this Chinese one-child policy is. And this is one of the issues. And one of the reasons that I'm talking about this today is not just the abortion issue, but it's also the fact that China is becoming perhaps the major player in the world, both economically and militarily. In fact, I think Vice President Biden was there to, sort of kowtow to the Chinese and build relationships with them. And so we need to realize that this is the morality of the rising giant in the world. And it comes from a Marxist background. It comes from a social engineering background. It comes from a secular state background. And I need to say that I have pretty good connections with the underground Chinese church. And I'll tell you, it's amazing what's happening over there, amazing what's happening in the church. And they, of course, are taking care of abandoned children. And it's fascinating to me that many of the pastors in the underground church are women. So in my view, it's almost as though God is saying, well, you abandoned them, I'm going to use them. And I think it's powerful. By the way, just as I close, 400 million human beings removed from the society in China since 79. Our abortion rate now is 2,500 a day. So we've dropped from an average of about 4,000 a day 10, 15 years ago, and now we abort in America about 2,500 a day. So here are some stats behind the news. Here's the story behind the news. I hope you'll pay attention to this trend, pay attention to what happens in Chinese abortion policy, because all of this is affecting the whole world. And as I've shared in other podcasts that we have here, demographics, the population trends and statistics that can tend to bore us sometimes. God knows my eyes glaze over when it comes to statistics. This is refashioning our world, and it's an important thing to pay attention to.
This Stephen Mansfield podcast was brought to you by the Mansfield Group. Find us at mansfieldgroup.com.